It's recording, cool. All right, so welcome to the Energy Policy and Climate Change lecture. And right before I start, I want to give some credit to the National Parliamentary Debate League and Shirley Chung. A decent amount of the resources and sort of information I got as a template and just sort of from taking notes from her lecture, and then I adapted it and added to it. Cool. So the first thing that we need to note is that in 2017, the World Resources Institute found that energy production and energy contributed to 72% of global emissions, which means that the two are highly tied together. So when we think about that, and we think about energy production, we can already through what we already understand, begin to see why that's the case, and particularly because of fossil fuels. Now, I'm pretty sure all of you guys are familiar with all of these, but I'm just going to go through all of them quickly and maybe add some information that you aren't too familiar with. So first onto coal, which contributes to 38% of global energy production. So historically, it's been the most popular. Ever since the Industrial Revolution and all the technology advancements that happened, coal has been very predominant in producing energy. But recently, we've begun to see a usage decline. For example, in 2007, 1.1 billion short tons of coal was used, while in 2019, that number was only 590 million. And the reason for that is because coal is extremely cheap. There's a ton of coal on the earth and in the earth. So that's led to just a lot of use of coal because it's cheap and it's easy to use and it can fuel what a business needs. But because coal and all the research that's come out with fossil fuels have found them to be extremely have found them to cause a lot of pollution, a lot of regulations have been placed on coal, and that's starting to that helps contributes to the decrease in the usage of coal. And then if you don't already know, coal is basically biomass that was formed in swamps, in shallow lakes, and over a lot of time through heat and pressure, that biomass was then turned into coal. And there's a quick diagram on there. That's sort of how coal is used and then converted into energy, or how it's converted into energy. So you can see it's mainly because coal is used to help start massive fires that produce steam, which then drives a turbine and gives us energy. So the second fossil fuel we're going to talk about quickly is petroleum and oil, which only contributes to 4% of global energy. It's primarily found below the ocean floor, and it's formed by organisms similar to how coal was formed. Crude oil can be then processed and made into many other products. And a lot of those products are used for transportation, and some of them are very hard to replace because of specific components and developments of these products, of vehicles and transportation. And so some of those products include diesel fuel, heating oil, jet fuel, waxes, lubricating oils, and a lot more. As you can see from the diagram, crude oil and petroleum is primarily basically always obtained by drilling into the ground and then drawing that oil up. And so obviously there's a lot of issues with pollution, there's issues with damaging the earth, and just a lot of those other environmental harms. And then the last fossil fuel that I'm going to mention briefly is, of course, natural gas, which contributes to 24% of global energy. And so, like the other two, it is also formed beneath the earth, and particularly like oil, beneath the earth's surface, and it's obtained similar to oil. Basically, you got to drill into the ground, you got to find these deposits, these reserves, and then you draw it up. And natural gas, like oil, can be found all over the place, and so there is a lot of it available. In the U.S., Texas draws 22% of the oil the United States uses, and Pennsylvania draws up 20% of natural gas. Texas draws up 22% of the U.S.'s natural gas, and so Pennsylvania draws up 20% of the U.S.'s natural gas. Now, the main benefit to natural gas is that when it's burned and when it's used, it emits less nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide compared to other fossil fuels. And so there's less pollution there, but in hindsight and just in consideration, we need to think about how local and regional areas can be affected, because if we increase natural gas production and obtainment in an area, that small local or regional area can definitely suffer from the increase in the drills and in the mining. Natural gas has been found to also emit 50 to 60% less carbon dioxide when it's combusted in a new efficient natural gas power plant compared with that of a normal coal plant. Now that's all good, But the main problem with natural gas is that of methane, particularly methane leaks, because methane is released. There's a bunch of other ways that methane can be released into the atmosphere, but with natural gas, like with drilling and obtainment, it's primarily through methane leaks, through like the wells when it's being pulled up, and through the pipelines when it's being transported. And so the reason why like this is such a big problem is because methane, a greenhouse gas, is much worse than carbon dioxide. Methane over a 20-year period is said to have an 86 times greater impact than carbon dioxide, and over a 100-year span, that number is 34 times. And so we can already see that methane is much, much worse than carbon dioxide. And so like it's debatable how much like it, if it really helps with any greenhouse gases, because like, yes, there's less carbon dioxide, but then now there's more methane. And then the last issue with natural gas is that it also increases the potential to cause earthquakes where natural gas is being extracted because you're drilling a well into the earth. You're implementing a lot of new structures and just a lot of things that you're putting into the earth to get the natural gas out, and that inevitably is going to have consequences to the earth. And so because of that, and basically with natural gas like obtainment, the governments have implemented specific methane loss standards, basically dictating like the amount of methane that can leak out cannot cross this threshold, because then it becomes extremely dangerous for our local environment and ecosystems. Sorry. Okay, so how does this tie into debate? Well, for topics, this is where you'll see topics on banning fracking and supporting renewable energy, which is what we're going to get into next. But sometimes, right, you aren't always going to be on the side that has to defend or gets to say we need to ban fracking. Sometimes you're going to need to be on the side where you may have to err and support, the use of fossil fuels. And the way you do that is by prioritizing the economy, because you can't just straight up go for renewable energies, and we're going to get to this in a second, because the infrastructure and the research and development is not 100% complete, and you basically need to put a lot of effort into developing those renewable energy sources. And so because of that, when you're supporting fossil fuel extractions and natural gas, you're basically helping those who have lower socioeconomic status, because the poor people, the impoverished, cannot spend more money on energy, right? The middle class and the upper class have that luxury, but when you're very strapped for cash, you don't have the opportunity to pay more for your electricity bill when it's like, wind energy versus like coal. And so when energy prices can go up, inevitably that's going to hurt the poor the most, since they're the ones who have to spend the most amount of money on it. So that's just sort of like when you have to defend a certain side, like how can you go about, potentially defending fossil fuels? And inevitably fossil fuels are going to be important in the transition to renewable energies, because it is very hard to just say we can snap a finger and quickly erect all the structure we need for renewable energies, for renewable energy. Another important thing to note is the solvency of renewable energy sources, because if you've read like the UN report in like 2019, I think, the deadline they said was that the world needs to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and we need to limit our global temperature increase by 1.5 degrees Celsius. Because when we compare 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius, which is the absolute worst, like the difference is extremely large. Not only that, they also set sort of a mandate, or just sort of like this goal that they set this goal of a 45% carbon dioxide decrease from 2010 to 2035 in order for us to help limit our global temperature increase by 1.5 degrees Celsius and get on that track to reach net zero by 2050. Now, that is very important to think about, because when you're introducing a plan or you're talking about, fossil fuels and developing renewable energy sources, you need to make sure your plan and your ideas can fit within that time frame. Because if you are implementing your plan way too late, or you don't take into effect some key warrants and evidence on how long like certain infrastructure that you're supporting takes to develop, you may very well and quickly lose the solvency battle, because you can't actually solve the problem. You could be potentially implementing a plan or an idea that just comes too late, and inevitably causes the world to lose against climate change. And so that is a very important thing to keep in mind. And then lastly, for impacts and arguments. So obviously a major impact that you can go for on like energy and like renewable energy topics is global warming, is the environment, all of these things that come with not solving, like the fact that the earth is slowly beginning to warm, or is warming, not slowly beginning to warm. But also you can bring up arguments like health effects, right? for example, if you're dependent on certain energy sources like coal and fossil fuels, you're also going to have a lot of particle pollution, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxides, and nitrogen oxides that can result in lung cancer. And there's a lot of other arguments that you can go off from there. So that's also something you need to keep in mind when you're talking about energy and when you're talking about renewable energy sources. Lastly, just a sort of important note that you can think about when you potentially debate these topics is that there's a large reservoir of fossil fuels, and it's very hard to say that the world is going to run out of them. Even in the past, when the world and when people have said, oh, we're going to run out of fossil fuels, so inevitably we have to switch, people always end up discovering a new source. They always end up discovering a new deposit. They always end up discovering something new that literally gives them more oil and more fossil fuels. And we can even look to the United States. From the Department of Energy, their own website and their own reports, they tell us that the US has more coal reserves than any other country in the world. And they tell us that it's enough to last more than 250 years. And so if that's the case, then you need to very push the narrative that you need to actively develop renewable energy. You can't passively sit back because, without any change, the easiest option is just to rely on fossil fuels. All right, so just quickly, do you guys have any questions before I move on? And I'm gonna do this sort of after I'm finished with a subsection, because this lecture is gonna get it's gonna cover a lot of information. So I don't want to overwhelm you, and I want to take a section to ask questions. So if you have any, just put them in the chat. If not, I will move on quickly. I don't have an exact number for the decrease in fossil fuels. It's more about how much emissions do we reduce, how much global emissions can be reduced, or 45% for carbon dioxide to basically meet that threshold. I don't think they tell us a specific decrease in fossil fuels because there's a ton of numbers that are getting thrown around. Any other questions? Yep, of course, sir. Okay, if not, I will move on to the next section of this lecture, which is that on
Wait,
renewable energy. Yeah, go ahead.
sorry. What is the source for the 45% decrease in CO2 emissions?
That's the UN. That's their own report from 2010 to 2035. Yeah. Cool. Just give me a second. Okay. Now on to renewable energy. So renewable energy obviously is not super environmentally intensive because you're basically cutting out all of the emissions and the harms you do to the environment. But there are the problems of upfront costs because you need money and you need resources to develop infrastructure to use renewable energy. You need the solar panels, you need the wind turbines, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one concern or one issue that needs to be factored in when we're talking about renewable energy. The second factor is that of storage and reliability, because renewable energy, for number one, isn't always constant. When you look at solar energy or wind energy, it's not always there. When it's nighttime or it's not windy, you're not going to get energy production. And the second thing is that there are questions on how reliable certain technologies are to store that produced energy from solar energy and from wind energy. Because no storage means you can't use that energy later when you already have enough. I don't have a ton of research on their technology, and I think it's pretty good as we exponentially develop more and more better technology, but it's still an important question when we're talking about renewable energy. So on to the first source, which is that of solar energy. And there are actually three main implementations of solar energy. The first, which you're probably very familiar with, is solar PV. Which is basically the panels on buildings, on your house, just basically the solar panels. And it's how sunlight can hit the electrodes on the panels. I know the diagram's kind of small, but basically sunlight hits electrodes on the panels that excites them and then generates energy. The second source or infrastructure that can provide us solar energy is solar H&C, solar heat and cooling. And what it does is it's actually collecting the heat energy from the sun to heat and cool facilities. And so it's less about getting electricity to use, but it's more about AC during or heating during the winter and managing heating and cooling. There's also something called solar photovoltaic plus thermal PVT. And it's basically a combination of these two. It's a combination of solar PV and sort of collecting thermal energy for usage. There's also the implementation of solar air heating for solar heating and cooling, and that's basically like heating the air in buildings or heating the air for agriculture. And so that's also an implementation of solar energy. The last implementation of solar energy is concentrating, it's called concentrating solar power. And it requires a lot of mirrors to be set up and they reflect sunlight toward a tower in the center of all like these mirrors. And I have a picture on the next slide, and that generates electricity. Now, the concern with concentrating solar power is you need a lot of land because with solar PV, you can just put it on the roof of your house and maybe, you can cut like 10%, 20% off your electrical bill. But concentrating solar power requires massive fields of solar panels to be set up and then directed to the center tower. And basically the way they work, the quick explanation, is that they have curved mirrors that focus the sun's energy onto the tower in the middle. And in that like tower, there's a very high temperature liquid, a transfer fluid. And basically that absorbs all the energy that's directed onto it, and it becomes extremely hot, reaching temperatures of 750 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. And because it's so hot, you can then transfer that heat to water to heat that water and make steam. And then we've already talked about steam can then power a turbine, which then gives you electricity. In general, the concern with solar energy is that the panels you use aren't incredibly efficient. Roughly 15 to 18% of the energy that comes in is what you get out of it. And so you need to use a lot of panels. That's why even on your house, you can't just have one. You need maybe 10 or you need a rows of solar panels. And yeah, in order to generate enough energy, you basically just need a good amount of panels. So this is what a concentrating solar power plant actually looks like. And you can see there are a ton of panels. Like you look at it and it's, it's a whole ring and it extends really far back and it's concentrating on the solar, like the solar tower in the center so that, it can generate a ton of heat energy to produce electricity. Now, obviously that means you need to use a ton of land. So that's why this is pretty obviously it's in the desert. But also you need to be careful because concentrating solar power plants can disrupt and destroy habitats and not necessarily make good use of what is already in place. But solar energy in general is very good in that there's a lot of benefits in jobs. It's actually pretty cheap to install like solar panels and implementations of like the smaller ends of solar energy, and it is more flexible and more constant because the sun will always be there for at least like roughly a third of the day, and so you have that energy there. The second type of renewable energy I'm going to talk about real quick is wind energy, and basically turbines, because that is how you get that's how you get like energy from like your turbines turning. And it's very efficient in the US because the US has a lot of wind around, and so we use turbines which convert the kinetic energy of the wind into power, and it's roughly 50% efficient. So the kinetic energy that comes in, we get about 50% of that. Now, the main debate is between onshore and offshore turbines, which basically means in the image, you see it's on the land, that's an onshore turbine, versus on the ocean, which is an offshore turbine. And the argument for offshore is basically if a turbine is placed on the ocean, you develop an infrastructure for that, the wind is more consistent over the ocean, and there's no like mountains, no landscapes or anything to block the turbines. Also, the turbines just have more energy to work with because you're over the ocean and the currents that are working over the ocean and in the air. But that's going to require you to add a bunch of other construction, potentially damage the environment more and ecosystems, because you need to somehow develop something under the turbine and all the connections you need to the turbine to make sure you can actually harvest that energy, and also make sure you maintain the turbine so it doesn't just break down. The other thing to note is that there's subtle difference, or there's differences in turbines based on their sizes, because you can have turbines that are much larger that spin and that power is then transferred to a grid, which is then distributed to a ton of people, or you can have smaller wind turbines which are specific to a home or a business, and so that's not necessarily shared across an entire community. There's also besides the concerns of how you develop onshore versus offshore turbines, there's also a small concern with birds, because inevitably, the turbines are spinning, they can be disturbances to birds, and potentially kill them if a bird accidentally goes through a turbine, gets cut, gets hit, whatever. But that's if that ever comes up in a debate, which it definitely has for me, your response to that is basically, it's not a big concern. Literally house cats kill more birds than turbines. So if that's your reason why we shouldn't develop turbines for wind energy, that's not a very good and strong reason. Last thing to note before I move on, wind energy is basically only turbines. It is not windmills. Windmills generate mechanical energy to do work, whether that's grinding corn, like all the other stuff that was done in the past, but it does not generate electricity. So it's not really wind energy, and it's not really implementation that you can consider when you're talking about renewable sources of energy. Okay, on to the third type of renewable energy, which is hydropower energy. Hydropower energy, which you can kind of guess from the name, is converting the flow of water into energy. And it pretty much will always require a dam, as you see in the picture. And this is very efficient, 90% efficient. And so that's why people like it a lot. And people like that's why there's so many dams in the world. Um, like there's already lots of dams in place, but because of that, it is pretty hard to expand the capacity of dams right now. Two-thirds of the world's longest rivers have been dammed to produce energy, and so and 70% of the planet's wetlands have been lost because of like all the water management that's been happening, and like the changing of the flows of rivers, also that we can use the water for agriculture, for through these dams, for like these dams, and just like electricity generation. And so not only do we have like that disruption there, or not only do we have like the disruption to wetlands, but obviously we have disruptions to ecosystems and to the environments of like the dam that these dams are situated in. It's bad for fish and salmon because fish need to go upriver to go to the breeding grounds, but dams can easily disrupt this, and so then you're harming like that whole ecosystem that starts with the fish and the salmon. We also can note that the number of species living in freshwater ecosystems has declined by a staggering 83% between 1970 and 2014, according to the latest Living Planet report by the World Wildlife Fund. And so that's a ton of ecosystem damage that really needs to be factored in when you're thinking about if you like want to push for even more dams when there's already a lot in place. And then also, we also need to know that dams can be very bad for indigenous people because, they're hunting those fish to survive, to eat that, and those fish are getting harmed by the dams and by the ecosystem that they're now like in. And so that is also like that's also an important environmental justice issue that we need to consider when you're trying to promote or when you're just trying to talk about dams in general and hydropower energy. Okay, now on to the fourth type of renewable energy, that of nuclear energy, which actually contributes to 10% of global energy. And so the primary way nuclear energy is like developed and done is through power plants and through the process of nuclear fission, which involves splitting uranium atoms to release the energy. And they pretty much always use U-235 because it's like it produces the most energy when it goes through nuclear fission. Now, it's technically like you could argue it's not renewable because you do produce radioactive like waste and nuclear waste when you produce nuclear power energy, but it's associated because nuclear power doesn't really produce any emissions. We can also note that nuclear waste that's produced can actually be reused. Like you can actually funnel it back into these power plants and into other ways to get energy, and they do that in France, for example, but just not in the United States. And then lastly, like uranium, like this can definitely be an argument. Like uranium isn't renewable because we have to mine for uranium, and then you need to produce U-235 to actually get, to actually go through nuclear fission to actually get energy. So that's definitely also a point to note that like, we're not like getting this from something that's always there or that can always come like the sun. Okay, so that's how like the power plants basically are like functioning and giving us nuclear energy, like a quick overview of that. Now let's talk about a lot of the wastes, like the waste point, and then also a lot of the concerns that come with nuclear energy. So primarily, like I've already mentioned, radioactive waste is going to be left over, and you need to dispose of it somehow. So there are questions of the environmental hazards those can actually pose, because you're dealing with nuclear waste that is radioactive. So that is always a concern. But the second important thing that we need to know is that nuclear power plants are really expensive because you need to develop all that infrastructure to like allow nuclear fission to happen to actually process U-235. But not only that, nuclear power plants have been associated with disasters, and so there's little political will to build them. And so, if you know Fukushima in 2011, basically a tsunami broke down like some of the nuclear power plants in Japan that caused radiation to leak into the lake, into the land and ocean, that contaminated the fish, the environment, harmed the people in near Fukushima, all those harms, like, and all that disaster has been associated with nuclear power plants. And so it's a very scary idea for the public to be like, yes, we should build another nuclear power plant. So there's Fukushima and there's also Chernobyl. If you know what that is, that was an explosion at a plant in Ukraine that spewed radiation that was enough for 400 Hiroshima-sized bombs. And so all of those disasters and probably a couple of more have really given nuclear power plants a bad stigma. Just they've made nuclear power plants seem like a bad idea when in reality, like it's like you can't be just intimidated by some of those disasters. There are also concerns about safety. Radiation can lead to cancer. There's also concerns about plant meltdowns because you're dealing with extremely high heats. And then also terrorist attack because, if you're dealing with a lot of radioactive material, what happens when terrorists can target that power plant and try to, release all that radioactivity, all that material into, the local area, into, let's say, the United States, since we're in the United States, right? So all of those concerns do pile up and sort of question nuclear power plants, but we also need to consider the upsides because nuclear power plants are extremely efficient. They can produce a lot of energy once you have the power plant for a cheap cost, and so they're very good at giving us a ton of energy to power societies, to power cities, be extremely helpful there. Obviously, there's zero emissions, but also you're producing jobs, like a lot of these energy sources, and there's arguments that and there's statistics to say that these disasters and events that happened weren't actually that bad, and if we compare them to other disasters and other situations in energy production, maybe it's not that much of an issue. And then also nuclear energy can be a source of constant electricity because you can always be running these power plants, day or shine, wind or no wind, if you have rain or enough water or not, whatever, right? And so there's a lot of upside to nuclear energy. And then also small point I forgot to note that these plants can also be a concern for indigenous peoples because you can potentially be spewing radioactivity, you can be harming the ecosystems, and so again there are environmental justice issues at play. Now, on to two sources of renewable energy that you may have never thought about or really considered. The first one is geothermal energy. Geothermal energy is the heat that's derived within the subsurface of the earth. That's the definition that I found from the EIA. And so it's water and or steam can carry that geothermal energy up. And so that's the energy that's from the magma in the earth. That's from the mantle, and particularly it's from the tectonic plate boundary. So where tectonic plates meet up, they're not completely joined together. And so when the heat that's spewing up from there, that heat can be obtained and it can be processed to give us energy. Now I have three GIFs in the presentation slides that you can see. And those are the three primary ways that you can harvest and basically get geothermal energy. Because the geothermal energy does require us to drill and to dig up wells to these hotspot areas to get the energy sources. And so these are the three basic power plant designs for how that geothermal energy can be obtained and processed. I'm not going to get into that. I don't even really understand it that well, and it's pretty complicated. But that's just something you can sort of note and see that there's a lot of options for renewable energy. And then lastly to note, it's not that we're pulling this energy up and then we're just not returning anything to the earth. If you look at the GIFs, you can see that we're pumping stuff back into the earth. This is the water, this is the resources that after we've harvested the energy, we're going to put it back into the earth. And the reason for that is because the earth is always warming itself. The earth is full of heat and it's continuously producing heat. And so it's renewable in that sense because you can draw energy up, you can put stuff back in, that stuff can be heated up, and then you can draw that stuff back out, get that energy, and the cycle can then continue from there. So obviously, that's decently clean carbon footprint. Yes, you have to drill down, but if you have that system in place, it is pretty clean. You aren't going to release emissions once you have these plants in place. But again, we're drilling into the ground, so we need to think about tremors, earthquakes, a lot of the other environmental issues that we can cause by trying to implement more of these kind of power plants. And the last source of renewable energy that I'm going to talk about quickly is biomass energy. Now, when I talked about coal, I did mention that coal is biomass that it was in swamps or lakes that has been, through a lot of time been compressed and processed with heat and pressure to become coal. So, how is biomass energy arguably renewable? How does it like not, release emissions? Like we're going to have to burn it to get energy. That's like one of the primary ways we can get energy from biomass. So the reason biomass energy is arguably renewable is because number one, the energy is derived from the sun, right? Plants that's where the biomass comes from, they absorb the sun's energy through photosynthesis. And what does photosynthesis require? It requires the conversion of carbon dioxide and water into the nutrients, into the carbohydrates that make up the biomass. So those plants and that biomass absorbed carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They took carbon dioxide out. And so whether we're using that energy directly and by burning it and or converting it into electricity, we can by converting to electricity, we're going to have to burn it, and that will give us energy, right? So really, it's like a net neutral in emissions because yes, you're burning, and yes, you're going to release carbon dioxide, but also like the plants absorbed carbon dioxide in the first place, and like statistically, that like difference between absorption and release actually isn't that far off because like with coal, you know, we're just burning coal and it's just going like the carbon dioxide is just getting released. There's no like carbon dioxide that's being taken in currently with that coal. That coal is pretty old, and so that argument can't be made for coal. So biomass includes algae, corn, wood, rice chaffs, and a lot of other ways. And so it's arguably cleaner than fossil fuels. Um, and yeah, and then also biomass doesn't just have to be burned to produce energy. It can also be turned into biofuel and ethanol, and there are policies in place. For example, in the United States, with a lot of states that say like the oil that is in these gas stations, like a small percentage needs to have ethanol or it needs to have biodiesel. And so there's also small ways that you can use biomass energy and implementations of biomass energy to help combat climate change. Okay. Any questions? I think I saw one in the chat. Um, I wouldn't, so for fish, when I was talking about hydropower energy, I can't necessarily say specifically. It's just sort of like in an ecosystem that has a dam in it, like because dams require large bodies of water. So that's usually by a lake, or even by large rivers, like for example the Amazon, the Nile. There's going to be a large body of water, and inevitably there will be fish in it. So it's not like I can't like tell you which species are specifically affected, but just knowing that like you've got a big body of water, there are going to be fish, there's going to be other animals and plants in that ecosystem, and the fact that like we humans are changing the currents or we're affecting the currents in the river to get power through these dams, that inevitably has potential harms to those fish and to those ecosystems. Are there any other questions? Jared, could you clarify what you mean by biodigestion?
It's like
And yeah,
there are plants and like a power plant, and it's like they use bacteria and microorganisms to like break down things, which produces like methane, and they use that for energy.
I haven't really heard about that. I'm going to talk about carbon capturing later, so maybe that's part of it. But like I did some research in preparing this presentation, well, obviously. But even then, there are still a ton of other methods of like fight of renewable energy sources and fighting climate change with policies that are out there that I haven't heard of, you haven't heard of, etc. Because like there's a lot of innovation that's happening in this field, and there's a lot of recent development. Um, and then what was your question on hydro energy use or storage?
Just like if you know anything about it, because I've like seen it. I took a glimpse at it. Kind of like they use like like the hydrogen, the gas to like store energy.
So do you mean energy with hydrogen, or do you mean like hydropower like water? Or do you mean like breaking hydrogen atoms to get energy?
Yeah, that one.
Uh, I mean, I would say it's like definitely possible. I haven't really read up or seen anything with that, but I would say like it's probably out there. Um, that like kind of ties into like nuclear energy because like nuclear energy, that derived from nuclear bombs. And so I would say like probably in the same way, if you know anything about hydrogen bombs were tested in the 60s. They've never been used ever in a war. Hydrogen bombs are like I think it's like it's at least like 1,000 times worse than nuclear bombs, and they cause a ton more radiation. So I don't like haven't really read about the development of hydrogen like energy or like hydrogen like breaking up hydrogen atoms to cause energy, because there's probably concerns on like how much radiation you release, or like maybe like I talk about plant meltdowns. That happens when there's so much energy and so much heat that's being produced. Like you start to melt the infrastructure and you start to break it, and then like at that point, that's where you have worries about leaks, about like damages, because like the infrastructure isn't secure and it's not super safe. So I haven't like really come up or ever introduced hydrogen energy. Maybe in the future that like becomes a lot more prominent. Awesome. If there are no more questions, I'm going to move on to the last section. Hopefully I can get through this quickly, um, of my presentation, and that is climate policies. I'm sure you've heard a couple of these: carbon tax, cap and trade. I just mentioned carbon capturing storage, and there's a few other policies I'm going to talk about. And these are things that you can implement in addition to or in place of like implementing like more development of renewable energy sources. So, maybe you're in a round and you have the choice of like, do we want to implement a cap and trade system, or do we want to implement like more solar panels or more wind turbines, right? So like there's a lot of options when you're talking about energy and renewable and like, fighting climate change. Okay, so on to the first policy, which is a carbon tax. A carbon tax is basically a tax per ton of carbon emitted by a country or a business, and it can be done upstream or downstream. Upstream means you're taxing the distributors, you're taxing the people who are giving out the fossil fuels to the companies, to the businesses. Taxing downstream means you're taxing the consumers, you're taxing the people, who are actually purchasing the fossil fuels to use. I am not going to get into that economics, and I don't quite understand that much myself. But the key point is to note that, like, basically, you're putting a cost on like your carbon footprint. You're being charged money, for releasing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Economics, sorry, excuse me. Some economics. Oh my gosh, I can't say the word. Some economists like a carbon tax because the rationale that like when you emit carbon, when you are producing a carbon footprint, you have to pay the cost. And that's the idea of a social cost, right? Like you are doing something, therefore you have to pay for it, right? And so like that's sort of like one of the rationales in support of a carbon tax. But when you're actually talking about a carbon tax, you can talk about like the implementation in Sweden, Norway, like all those like Nordic countries. But there's also examples like in Australia who implemented a carbon tax, but then rolled it back because like difficulties arose. And so whichever side you're on, it's always good to bring up the specific examples and precedents of carbon taxes that have been implemented and introduced, because there's a lot of details you can pick out of why it failed or why it was successful. And then lastly, the general idea with a carbon tax is the idea that businesses and industries will look for and invest in a cheaper, better alternative if they have to pay that much money for, using fossil fuels, which produce carbon dioxide, when they can be using energy from solar panels that doesn't entail that carbon tax. And then we're going to get into a cap and trade program next, but they differ in the sense that a carbon tax gives you a very specific, a high level of certainty about the cost. You're going to know how much the tax is, but it's not giving you a certain amount of like emission reduction that you want. Like the idea of the carbon tax is we're going to put money on, every time you have to pay money every time, you use fossil fuels, every time you add to your carbon footprint. But that doesn't say like, hey, we're going to reduce emissions by 40% by this deadline. All it's saying is that we're going to implement this cost. And so some concerns obviously that are going to come with the carbon tax are if you raise the cost of energy and you tax the distributors, they might raise their costs. And so energy then just becomes more expensive. That hurts society in general because that can pretty much hurt society in general because, we want cheap energy. We want to be able to do the things we do. but also particularly, again, as I mentioned, for the impoverished, for those who are, in the low, who have lower socioeconomic statuses, they suffer the most because now they got to spend more of their small paychecks in paying for energy. Okay, now onto a cap and trade or a cap and trade program. And this basically is a cap on the total amount of emissions, hence the cap part. I'm basically saying like, we can't cross this threshold, or this is how much emissions we're trying to reduce, right? And then you distribute an emissions allowance to companies, and it's basically like you get to release this much emissions. Like if you're, if you're a company that manages factories, you only get to release this much emissions. Now, if your company doesn't like use all of your emissions allowance, if you will, you can trade it and you can sell that leftover emissions to other companies who may produce more. So if you look at the image, you can see, the company that has a lot of unused allowance, they're going to trade it to the company that has, they're actually going over their limit. And so that company will buy the extra allowance. And now, in general, you're cutting down emissions because of like this whole program. And so obviously, this cap and trade program sets a high level of certainty about future emissions, but it doesn't specify the price of those emissions, right? Those companies are the ones who get to decide, hey, we're going to trade, this much like emissions allowance for this cost. And so they're the ones kind of dictating the prices themselves. But the amount of allowance that was allowed in the first place was because of the bar you set, right? The lower the bar, the stricter the guideline. Obviously, having an emissions allowance and having leftover is more valuable than if that bar's, it's pretty high, and so there's less concern about going over it. Environmentalists like this because it sets a hard cap on emissions, right? Like we know, like we're gonna do our best. We're gonna reduce emissions by 30% by setting this limit. And so there is flexibility in implementing energy efficiency because of the ability that, like, if they're less able to be if a company is less able to be energy efficient, they can buy that energy, right? And so there's a lot of flexibility there. Instead of just saying like, you use this much carbon, you gotta pay this much. And the precedents and the examples are California and Europe. So California, our state, has a cap and trade program in place, and so does Europe. And so if you want to delve more into the specifics there, you can look at a lot of the issues and benefits that come up. There's some other concerns that get like really jumbled, and I don't want to get super into it. But there's problems that arise with like, how do you actually sell this allowance, and like what does it mean, and like can you auction it off, and like what's the right amount of price, and like redistribution, that can get really jumbled. And the fact that like companies that can buy more emissions are, they're the ones who can predominantly hurt people of color, hurt minorities, those big companies that have the money to go over the limit and then pay for it all. Like, is that really fair? And then also there are carbon offset programs, which are like, if you go over like your limit, you can deal with that. You can compensate for that by like planting a tree. There are, issues there with like, is that like actually fair? Like, is planting a tree like arguably equivalent to like going 20 tons over your limit? There's a lot of concerns there. And then lastly, obviously, concerns that these offset programs aren't efficient, and then market and volatile issues that happen that can arise with cap and trade programs, because people will always want energy. There's a constant supply, but the demand for the energy there's always energy being produced, right? Like, renewable energy sources are always pumping it out. There's always coal that you can burn, but how much energy people want is always going to fluctuate. It's easily changeable, and so energy prices will fluctuate. And so if you're constantly trading back and forth and you're doing all this like work, that can raise issues with investors, raise concerns there. And then quick small point that like, how do cap and trade programs affect local politics and local citizens, right? Because like we may say the net benefits in the debate are this, but then what if we focus on, say, like Bakersfield, for example? Like, how are they affected? Maybe they're hurt and not actually helped because of the cap and trade program. Okay, on to a quick point, which is that of renewable portfolio standards. These you can probably always bring up if you really want to. And it's basically this policy model where you say a specific amount of renewable energy needs to account for a certain amount of energy, renewable energy needs to account for a specific amount of the energy grid. Like, 20% of our energy grid that we distribute must come from renewable energy. That's like a potential renewable portfolio standards. And you can ramp it up over time, right? Because arguably, we're trying to reduce emissions, we're trying to meet that goal. And so if we can start reducing emissions, we can slowly increase the amount to the point where we can eventually be at zero emissions or very near zero emissions. 30 US states actually implement renewable portfolio standards, but each one is different. There's a typo there, because like it's flexible. It's not like this is renewable portfolio standard and this is what you got to do. It's like you get to decide based on your state, based on your markets, your industries, how you fluctuate how you fluctuate the standards, how do you ramp it up so that you can help fight climate change. And so they're very popular because they help encourage competition. Ambitious ones can help you create lots of jobs. They can spur economic development, reduce pollution, save money, because you're basically increasing the value and investment towards renewable energy sources. The main issues and like kind of you need to be careful, or like how do you actually implement these renewable portfolio standards? And then there's questions about efficiency, but that can get really messy. So yeah, renewable portfolio standards are very popular and they're very good at helping us fight climate change. Carbon capturing storage. I've got this and two more, and this whole presentation will be done. So just stick with me a little bit. I'll probably go slightly over time. And also I'll be putting the slideshow up on the Google Classroom. There's a ton of sources I've listed in the speaker notes. So feel free, if you're interested or you want to learn more about a specific policy or implementation that I mentioned, go ahead, look at the sources and you can look for a lot more information. Anyways, carbon capturing storage is basically taking carbon out of the air. You're basically like actually sucking it out in this process of sequestration, right? And so the argument for this is basically there's too much carbon in the air at this current rate. So we actually need to take some of it out. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what happens. Even if you cut what's currently being emitted, there's still too much anyways. And basically what happens is they take the carbon out basically right from the plant emissions. So when it's coming out right away, the carbon capturing storage is like, all right, we're going to take like 90%, we're going to take it out, and then they pump it back underground. So if you look at the image, that's where we got coal from. That's where there are some deposits and where we can kind of safely put it away. It has been implemented. There's a lot of development right now, and the capacity for carbon capturing storage is starting to grow right now, and it's starting to become a lot more mainstream as compared to like a carbon tax or some of the other ideas talked about. Now, the main concerns are the fact that what happens if your pipelines or your distribution leaks, right? Then a ton of carbon dioxide that you've collected is now going into the air. It's now potentially damaging public health, safety, and then also like your underground resources, right? Like you don't want to put carbon dioxide right next to a potential water storage, because what happens if that carbon leaks and then infects and like damages that water storage, and now all that fresh water can't be used because it's contaminated, or now you got to put a ton more effort into getting the carbon dioxide out. And so you need to be very careful. We need to be very careful with carbon capturing storage because there are some of these concerns. Okay, so the solar investment tax credit, real quick, it's basically an incentive for people to install solar panels and technology, and it's a very, very good at boosting industry growth and promoting more jobs. There aren't that many harms and concerns really with it. It's already passed through Congress. It's a bipartisan bill, and it's been pretty successful in boosting particularly the solar energy industry. The way it works, real quick, basically, if you purchase and you begin the implementation of solar technology, solar panels, you get to deduct the percentages shown, the percentage of the installation cost. So if it's 2020, if I purchase and I start implementing solar panels, I get to deduct 20% of that installation cost from my taxes. And so that's going to help the solar industry grow because the installation of solar technology is now so cheap and it's really good to go for it. And you can see there's the kind of a ramp down. Not really going to get into that a ton, but just understand this is a pretty good policy. It's already been implemented. So if you want to talk about it, maybe introduce some new stuff, maybe ramp it up instead of down, etc. Those are a lot of things you can consider. But yeah, this is a pretty good policy. Now on to the last one, which you may or may not have heard of, the Green New Deal. This was proposed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her call in her specific and some of her specific colleagues. And just quickly, this calls for meeting 100% of energy through clean renewables, 0% emissions by 2030. This calls for upgrading facilities and buildings to help us meet this demand. It calls for overhauling transportation. It calls for education training. It calls for Medicare for all. Now, I just listed a ton of things and policies that the Green New Deal is basically like incentivizing and saying like, hey, we need to do this. And the American Action Forum has found that implementing the GND would cost an astounding $93 trillion over the next decade. Now, I would need to investigate that form a little bit to see maybe if it's biased or not. But regardless, the Green New Deal is a very expensive policy that some are thinking about, that some support and a lot are also basically against because it's so expensive. It's arguably only going to worsen our debt. And like, how do you actually pay for, even if it's not $93 trillion, right? How do you still pay for something like that? The arguments against that, and like how you pay for, are you're going to give the economy a big boost. So you invest now, and the economy will make up for it. You can also argue that like you're going to create a lot of jobs, and you're going to help minorities, and you're going to boost society in that aspect. And so, there are some arguments against how you can actually. There are some arguments for how you can actually pay for the Green New Deal. Also, just a quick note, like the Green New Deal calls for government control, more government control, because the GND mandates a smart grid, which is basically like we're going to pool all the energy and we're going to through a smart grid, we're going to like effectively distribute all the energy outwards. But that calls for the government to take more control, use its powers to then implement such a measure. Now, this is not political, but just know that it's already been implemented, or not implemented. It's been proposed and it's been the vote has been put through Congress. And in 2019, the vote failed by 0 to 57 vote in the Senate. 4 Democrats and 53 Republicans said no. Everyone else said present, and they didn't take a stance. And so, I highly recommend not running the Green New Deal unless you do a ton of research and a ton of just going through the arguments, because there are a lot of arguments against the Green New Deal that are pretty simple, and they don't require a ton of research, because there's also an understanding that the Green New Deal is pretty expensive, and like, how do you actually pay for that? All right, my last slide, just real quick. I gave you guys, I just threw out a ton of information for you guys during this lecture. I talked about fossil fuels. I talked about renewable energy implementation, at least 12, 15 implementations. I then give you guys a ton of policies to think about. But just realize that there's even more. Policies can, if you are developing a plan when you're actually debating energy, you can talk about financial incentives. You can talk about appliance and transportation efficiency, maximizing that. You can talk about the renewable portfolio standards, energy consumption goals and targets. We can't go over this limit. You can only use this much energy from fossil fuels. And then lastly, research and development grants, giving money so we can fund more renewable energy implementations that'll help drive down the cost of renewable energy and make it more accessible for all, which is what we need in order to fight climate change. And so all of these ideas that I've just presented to you, it's a lot of food for thought, but it's also a lot of options now that you can see when you're debating these topics. There's a lot of ideas and arguments that you can run. And so there's a lot of flexibility and creativity for you to do research and find what you really are passionate about, what you really support, and what you think is the best method. So thanks for listening. That's all I have for this lecture. And then are there any final questions before we basically close today? Cool. So if not, it's 6:06. You guys are all free to head out. I'm gonna stop screen sharing, and I'll stop there for a sec. You guys are all free to head out. I will be posting this Google slide, and there's a ton of resources in the speaker notes, so feel free to check those out. Yep. Thank you guys for coming, and have a great day.